Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of March of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start and let's talk about the South Kherson direction. During the previous 24 hours we got lots of updates and details from the area between Kherson and Oleshki. This is like Dachi, the residential area that were captured by the Ukrainians during the previous year, and since that time we stopped receiving any updates from the territory because the main focus was on Krynki and the area around Krynki. And after the Russians forced the Ukrainians to fall back from Krynki, and after the Russians destroyed that bridgehead, the Russians moved their focus back to Kherson and started bombing and attacking the Ukrainians between the islands, between the banks of the river. There are a lot of options and why the Russians start doing this. The first one, as I told you, very likely after the Ukrainians lost their foothold in Krynki, the Russians managed to release significant manpower, significant resources, and currently the Russians are trying to use the resources, artillery forces, and they start bombing Dachi once again. From the other side, maybe the Ukrainians realized that attack to Krynki was a really suicide operation. They made some homework, they made some conclusions of that operation. Now they try to probably repeat the same story, but from Kherson or around Kherson, because when attacked the Russian forces from Kherson and the Russian bank of the river in front of Kherson, it is much more easy to control the foothold, to see Oleshki, to attack with FPV drones, because the main reason why the Russians won the battle for Krynki was that the Russians were using FABs and FPV drones and artillery, and the Ukrainians concentrated their forces along the Ukrainian bank of the river, and they were under Russian fire and they had significant losses. When talking about Kherson, the Ukrainians can concentrate forces in this city and to send forces with the small groups without almost zero risk of being attacked by the Russians. So maybe this is the reason, who knows. When talking about the Ministry of Defense, as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians lost 85 soldiers on the entire Kherson direction, including the losses in Robotine. From Robotine, we continue receiving a lot of updates, and we got another geolocated video of how the Russians were bombing the southern part of the city, of the village, which confirms that the Russians very likely were forced to fall back from this part. But when talking about the reports, some sources are saying that the Russians advancing, some sources are saying that the Russians were forced to fall back. So the situation in Robotine is still covered with the fog of war, and it's very difficult to understand what exactly is happening there. Now we are moving to the South Donetsk direction. We have a lot of very interesting details and updates from Novomykhailivka. Just yesterday we were talking about the video of Russian flag established in the central part in the vicinity of the church. Today we got additional video, and now the Russian soldiers feel themselves more secure, more comfortable in this area, which probably means that Ukrainians were forced to fall back further to the west or to the northern part. This video was made on the eastern, let's say, side of the building that was geolocated, and we have icon on the map. And on this video we see the Russians very slowly, step by step, establishing the flag of 155th Marine Brigade that operates in this area. And when talking about the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, according to information we have, the Ukrainians lost 320 soldiers on the South Donetsk direction, and this is the heaviest losses from this direction since the beginning of the year. So when talking about the losses, total losses, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours had significant level of losses, the biggest number since the beginning of the year, and the total number of losses is more than 1,400 soldiers. Some mappers updated their maps showing additional progress of the Russian armed forces, and today we got additional reports that during the day the Russians continue offensive operation further to the western part and the northern part of the village. So very likely that by the morning we're going to receive additional updates. And when talking about Novomykhailivka itself, there are two important regions that the Russians still left to capture, and we are talking about the central part, this one, the part with, let's say, high-rise buildings, if we can call these buildings high-rise, and the farms on the northern part of Novomykhailivka. If the Russians are able to capture these two positions, then the battle for Novomykhailivka basically will be ended by this progress, and then it's going to be just a matter of time and not the question whether the Russians are able to do this or not. Even now when talking about the Novomykhailivka, it's not the question whether the Russians are able or not, it's just a question of time. But after these two areas the progress will be much speed up, and the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back further to Konstantinovka. So the battle for Novomykhailivka is about to be finished. Obviously, we're not talking about months, we're talking about few, maybe 3 weeks, and this is going to be the end. Now we're moving to Krasnohorivka. We continue receiving updates from the southern part. As we discussed in the previous updates, the Russians have already established control over most of the streets according to the Telegram channels and Twitter channels, but for now without any geolocated proofs of that. We got an additional video of how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian T-72 tank somewhere on the southern part below the railways, and as a result of Krasnopol hit, that tank was destroyed. When talking about any progress, we haven't received anything about further updates or whether the Russians managed to establish complete control or something. Now we are moving to Avdiivka direction, and according to the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians lost significant number of losses, 490 soldiers just on this direction. But regarding the level of losses, the Russians still haven't managed to bypass the main defense belt that goes from Ocheretina to Berdychi to Semyonovka to Orlovka to Mansk and to Karlovka Reservoir. So these areas still under Ukrainian control. And once again, one can say that Ukrainians managed to stabilize the front line. Yes, I agree with these people that they managed to stabilize, but they managed to stabilize the line of combat contact just due to significant use of manpower. The Ukrainians lost just for the previous 24 hours around 500 soldiers just to hold this line and not to allow the Russians to bypass the water reservoirs. We don't know the real exact numbers of losses from the Russian side, but anyway, let's discuss every let's say direction, every single village step by step. First, let's talk about Toninka. This is the let's say the area with the biggest problems from the 3 settlements, and the main problem is that the Ukrainians, if they want to hold Toninka, they need to bypass significant distances with armored vehicles. And for example, if they want to send armored vehicles to Toninka, they need to bypass up to 6 kilometers. When the Ukrainians want to send just infantry, they need to bypass less distance, let's say 2 kilometers. But anyway, this is too big. And this area that located behind Toninka is under complete Russian fire control, and not just this area, but also some streets and of the village itself. We have lots of geolocations confirming abandoned and destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles that Ukrainians sent to Toninka with this purpose to stabilize the area, but most of those attempts were repelled by the Russians, and Ukrainians having losses, were losing significant number of armored vehicles. So according to my understanding, Toninka will be first in these 3 towns. Regarding the fact that the Russians have already bypassed almost the half of Orlovka and more than the half of Berdychi. And additional information about Toninka is that the Russians during the previous days were attacking the Ukrainians in the northwestern part just using the central street, but today we got additional geolocation of how the Ukrainians using FPV drones were attacking the Russians along the northern road. So now the Russians are trying to attack Toninka from 2 directions. The first direction is along the central street, and the second direction along the 3 lines and to the northwestern part of the village. So 2 directions, of course, means more chances for the Russians to complete the battle as fast as possible. Moving to Orlovka, we have additional updates, 2 geolocations from both sides. The western part either under Ukrainian control or in the gray zone. The Russians haven't managed to bypass the central part, and we see the footage of Toninka at the western part, significant damage. The village was almost reduced to ruins. The signs of artillery strikes, of FPV drone strikes, of aviation strikes. So the storm assault process continues, but we see that there is almost no progress on the ground. The Ukrainians also published the video confirming the edge Russian positions. The video was published by 110th Brigade. On this video we can see the use of very likely of J-Dam bomb against the Russian positions inside of the school, which confirms the Russian progress and Russian, let's say, edge positions in the village. So this is the situation, and if we are talking about Orlovka the same way as we were talking about Toninka, we need to understand the main supply roads in the village, and let's say this is the village, and the Ukrainians just need to bypass, let's say, something around less than 1 kilometer or around 1 kilometer, less than 1 kilometer to get forces from Severna village to the Orlovka itself. The last distance allows the Ukrainians to be more secured on the roads, to have chances during the night period of time to send some reinforcements, reserves, to stay invisible, and to hold the position, to hold the defense in the village, at least least in the western part. The same story we can tell about Berdichi. The distance between, there is no even distance between, let's say, the western part of Berdichi and the mainland, because one village goes to another village, and the Ukrainians don't have problems to sending reinforcement to this area and to hold the line. So that's why the Russians are so slow. From the other side, there is a very important, let's say, video, a very important asset on the line is Abrams tanks. And during the next few days, I expect a very heavy clashes for this area, because you have already seen the video of FPV drones strikes against the tanks, but there are a few important notes that you need to, let's say, keep in your mind. The Russians used 2 drones to attack Abrams tank, and they haven't managed to do this. The tank wasn't destroyed. Probably the tank was damaged, but the tank wasn't destroyed. There are a few things we can, let's say, tell about this. Obviously, the Russians do have chances to destroy the tank. They basically can drop grenade into the open doors of the tank from on the top, on the roof of this armored vehicle, but for some reason the Russians are not doing this. And obviously the Russians wants to evacuate Abrams, let's say to Moscow, to the Red Square, or maybe to other towns, and to show these Abrams tanks as a trophy some of the territory of Russian Federation. And that's mean that this Abrams tanks is a very, let's say, important asset, very, let's say, expensive asset for the Russians, which they will try to capture within the next few days. The Ukrainians probably understand the situation as well, and they will do their best and not to allow the Russians to capture and evacuate the tank from one side, but from the other side they will use the tank as the trophy, as a trap. When the Russians will send forces for evacuation, of course the Ukrainians will try to attack the Russians with FPV drones. So something interesting is going to happen there, and then we're going to find and get an answer whether the Russians are able to evacuate Abrams, and then to show this Abrams somewhere in the Red Square or not. When talking about the Russians in the same area, we see certain Ukrainian focus exactly on the fields between Avdiivka, Lastachkina and Orlovka. The Ukrainians, for example, in this video shown us the video of how the Russian storm squad was moving from Avdiivka to Lastachkina, then to Orlovka, but the storm squad was got under the cluster rounds artillery strikes, and probably the Russians had losses. So this is the reason. And if we calculate, let's say, the same thing from the Russian side of the main supply and, let's say, support roads from Avdiivka to Orlovka, the distance is around 5 kilometers. So the Russians need to bypass 5 kilometers under the open sky. The Ukrainians don't need to bypass anything, and this is the reason why the Russians are so slow. The Ukrainians control the main supply roads, and they attack them every single day with cluster rounds, with drones. So that's why the Russians are so slow. Now we are moving to global scope of the area. Other sources reported that MI6 has transferred new intelligence to the office of the President of Ukraine and the General Staff that the Russian army is increasing its stockpile of missiles and drones for a major counter-offensive which could begin in May and June this year. British intelligence assumes that the main blow will be made on Selidovo-Pokrovsk to create a springboard for future operations to cut the entire front. And this is very interesting to note, because after the fall of Avdiivka we have forgotten about the missile strikes, and if you ask my opinion, I won't even be able to tell you when exactly the Russians made a massive attack all over the entire Ukraine with missiles. Obviously before the fall of Avdiivka, and from that date we have already 3 or 4 weeks have already passed on that date, maybe 2 weeks have already passed. So now, as you can see, the Russians are focused to concentrate missiles, to concentrate long-range missiles, and in the next month or maybe 2 they will try to increase the number of missiles, and after that everything will be start from the beginning. So we can say that the flag telling us that the Russians are going to start new offensive will be the massive missile strikes all over the entire Ukraine. For now we see nothing, so that's when the Russians are trying to finish the operations they started in November and October. One of the operations have almost been completed. We're talking about Avdiivka, we are talking about Novomykhailivka, and of course we are talking about Chasiv Yar. Also, if you mention the Russians decreased the use of FABs in the Avdiivka area, and the reason of that, according to the Russian sources, that most of the aircrafts were redeployed to Chasiv Yar, and now this is the main area of FABs use. The Russians are bombing this territory up to 100 or even more FABs per day, and we have a lot of geolocated proofs of that. The main area of concentration of Russian FAB fire is the west-eastern block of Chasiv Yar. This territory is under very heavy fire. The Russians still haven't launched any offensive operation in this direction. There are still lots of things to do until they can do this, but anyway, this area is under very heavy pressure, and this exactly is going to be the main area for the next month or two before the May-June Avdiivka further offensive operation. The Russians during the next 2 months will try to complete Ivanovska and to complete the story of the eastern part of Chasiv Yar. Maybe the Russians will also try to cross the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal and to enter the central part of Chasiv Yar as well. So the clashes on this direction continues. When talking about Ivanovska, according to information we have, the Russians have almost established control over the half of the village. The clashes continues, and the Russians continue pressure to the northern part, to the southern part, and of course to the central part as well. For now, we don't have any updates whether the Russians managed to achieve some results or not. Now we are moving to Terny, to southern Kupyansk direction. We got 2 updates from the territory. The Russian sources reported about offensive operations towards Terny, and as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to defeat the Ukrainians and to establish control over the first buildings in the eastern part of the village, and this is approximately the Russian control by, let's say, 8 p.m. of the local time, according to Telegram channels and Twitter. We have also the video of attack of 60th Mechanized Brigade. The video was published by the 60th Mechanized Brigade of Russian attack. Significant number of armored vehicles. Some armored vehicles were destroyed as a result of artillery fire, some got on mines. So the Russians renewed their attempts to attack Terny on this direction, and probably the next few days we're going to receive more and more updates. When talking about the Ministry of Defense, the level of loss of Ukrainians was around 160 soldiers. Once again, today, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians had the biggest losses since the beginning of the year. We see also some restart of Russian activity on Kislovka-Kotlarovka. After the Russians captured Tabaevka and Krakhmalna, they stopped, and we stopped receiving any updates from this direction. But starting on the 4th of March, the Russians renewed their attempts to, capture these territories. We see additional artillery strikes, and very likely the next few days we're going to receive more and more videos, and very likely the Russians are planning to, after a very long operational pause in Sinkovka, Kislovka-Kotlarovka, to renew offensive with the purpose to completely establish control over these territories. We got more details and more updates from Kharkiv direction. The Russians destroyed some positions of Ukrainians in the vicinity of to the south of Vovchansk. We got the video of how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian sabotage group along the border. The Russians discovered them, and after that they start bombing and attacking them with artillery. So we see some activization on this direction as well, and we have the Russian bombings of village in the Nabrodovka. So all these actions tell us that very soon that the Russians still in the process of preparation the greatest Kharkiv offensive operation. When exactly this operation is going to take place, nobody knows, but everything tells us that probably very soon. Now let's talk about global updates. We have some additional information. According to Ukrainian sources, since December last year, the Ukrainian government has practically not begun the construction of defensive lines, despite numerous statements on this matter, said Ukrainian propagandist Yuri Butusov. And this is a very bad piece of news, because the Ukrainians not in a very inoffensive state. They need the defense, but they don't have new defense, let's say, lines. From the other side, we see that the Ukrainians failed their mobilization process, and now the Ukrainians try to motivate the people by giving them some bonuses for destroyed Russian equipment. For example, the Ukrainians plan to pay up to $10,000 if a soldier destroys Russian tank, and many other costs. For example, for military helicopter, the Ukrainians are planning to pay a little bit less than $8,000. For destroying warship, the Ukrainians are planning to pay from $8,000 till $13,000, and many other different costs for different types of things. And this is probably for the Ukrainians a smart step, trying to motivate people, but we understand that Ukraine is a corrupted country, and even if a regular soldier on the ground destroys another tank, obviously he will not get his money, because the sergeants and the officers, high-rank officers, will take these victories on their own list, and they will get the money, and the soldier will not get anything, and maybe even soldier will disappear if he start, let's say, trying to find out why he haven't received money. Furthermore, we got another episode of democracy in Ukraine. On this video, we can see how the Ukrainians tried to mobilize a person in Mukachova. As you can see, there was a fight, and they tried to put a man into the bus, but their attempt failed, and they basically left this body on the ground and ran away from the village. So as you can see, the situation is critical in Ukrainians. No rights, no democracy. The president of Serbia, Vucic, says that Western countries first ruled out supplying Ukraine with numbers of weapons, but they transferred them anyway. So he's trying to say that very likely that NATO countries will send forces to Ukraine, and that they're going to do this year. From the other side, we see that the NATO countries started the military exercises in Finland, and of course this is not very good for Russia, because the NATO countries use around 20,000 soldiers for these exercises, which means that the Russians need to keep some forces in this area to move them from the line of combat contact, or from, let's say, some reserved areas, and to move them to the north, and to keep some aviation there, because it's like normal practice. And this is, let's say, of course, let's say, moved Russian focus from activity in Ukraine to some northern directions. Also, we got updates, continue receiving updates from the United States of America, and the most important is that very likely till the mid-April, the Ukrainians are not going to see any money from the United States of America. But the thing is that even if somewhere in the end of April or the beginning of May, the Ukrainians receive money, as let's say the former head of the US Armed Forces General Mark Milley told us, Ukraine will face death if Congress does not pass an aid package. So the Ukrainians are losing time, and the Russians till the beginning of May can conduct such a critical damage to Ukraine. So regarding the number of money they will receive, they will never be able to stand on their legs once again. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.